Hello, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. In today's lesson, we're going to be discussing the topic of typecasting, which is a way of converting variables of one data type to another data type. So in today's lesson, we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to first talk about something, a term called type juggling, which is something that PHP does, which is a way it automatically sort of converts items of variables of one particular data type to another. We're going to talk about typecasting itself, which is the actual process of doing that. And then we're going to talk about a couple of different common conversions, like when you cast or convert a variable of one data type to another, certain rules apply and certain things occur. And we're going to talk about some common cases for strings, for some arithmetic operations, and for converting things to Boolean values. So type juggling, what does that mean? Well, PHP is known as a weakly typed language. And then what that means is that when you declare a variable in PHP, you don't have to give it an explicit type. So when we do a equals 1, we're not saying to the compiler, or excuse me, to PHP that that a is an integer variable. PHP determines the variable's type from its context. So if we assign it an integer, it's going to be an integer variable. If we assign it a variable, a floating point number, PHP knows that b is a floating point number. This is different from strongly typed languages where, for example, in another language you might, if you want to declare a to hold an integer, you'd actually have to preface it with, like, for example, maybe the int keyword, which says that a is a data type integer. Now the thing about PHP is, because it's weakly typed, a variable can also change data types. Whereas in other languages, you might only be able to assign integers to a variable that's declared an integer. In PHP, if we have a equals 1, in the next line of code, this means this statement will say a is an integer that's equal to the value 1. We could, in the very next line, say a is equal to 2.5, and we've just implicitly changed the data type of the variable a. PHP now knows that a is a float data type, and it does that on its own. And because in languages, operations and functions require data of certain types to work, for example, numeric operators require numbers, the string concatenation operator requires strings to be its operands. Because they require that, PHP does what's known as automatic type conversion. In other languages that aren't weakly typed, you actually have to explicitly use, for example, if you're adding integers, you have to explicitly use two variables that are of the data type integer. In PHP, it does that for you automatically. If you try to add two numbers and they're not both integers, PHP does an automatic conversion for you. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the specifics of actually numeric conversions that it does. So if, for example, like when you add two numbers, it requires them to be numbers. If you provide in PHP two variables to an addition operator that are not numbers, PHP is automatically going to convert them for you to the appropriate type and then perform the operation. This automatic conversion is known as, what the lesson is titled today, typecasting. And that's basically converting data from one data type to another. Because this happens automatically in PHP, PHP has certain rules that it follows when it does this, and they may not be that obvious. So it's important that you understand the automatic casting rules that PHP uses so that you can get expected results. So typecasting, as mentioned, is the process of changing a variable from one data type to another data type. This can be either done implicitly, as in automatic type conversion, where PHP converts the data type for you, or you can do it explicitly, where you can explicitly say, I have a variable that's an integer, I want to make it a float. There are two ways to explicitly cast a variable from one data type to another. You can use parentheses syntax, which we're going to talk about in a second, or the setType function. So for example, if we have a variable here, int1, that's set equal to the integer value, integer literal 1, and we want to make that a float variable. What you can do is we can create a new variable called float1, and what we do is we set it equal to the integer variable name, and then what we do is we have parentheses with the word float in between them. And what that means is this parentheses segment right here says take the value of int1, convert it to a float, and then assign it to float 1 over here. Set type does a similar thing, except and the way set type works is it's a function that has what are known as it has two arguments, which we're going to learn more about when we learn more about functions. But for right now, you can just know that basically you write set type and then a pair of open and closed parentheses, and then you pass it two pieces of data. You pass it the variable you want to cast, in this case num. We're going to cast the variable num, and then you pass in a string that says what you want to cast it to. So what this operation is going to do is cast the variable num, which maybe is an integer, to a Boolean. So it's going to change it from a number data type, like an integer data type, to a Boolean data type. Now, one thing to note is that when you use parentheses casting, as up here, it doesn't permanently change the data type of the object or of the variable that it's casting. So when this operation here completes, I'll clean this up a little bit. So when this statement right here completes, int1 is still going to be an integer. It's just its value was converted to a float before it was assigned to float1, but int1 is still an int. If you use the set type function to explicitly cast it, it actually changes the type of the variable specified. So this is essentially the same as if we had used parentheses for them. So whereas up here, the variable to the right of the cast in parentheses, its value data type doesn't get changed. Down here, because we're assigning it back into the same variable name, its data type does get changed, and that's what the set type function does. So what are the different casts that you can do in PHP? Well, basically, you can cast between any of the different data types. You can change all the data types from one to another. Using the parentheses syntax, there are two ways to cast to an integer. You can use int or integer between parentheses, and you just put that before the variable that you want to cast. For float, you can use the word float, double, or real, and those are sort of legacy terms that floating point numbers used to be referred to as, but the most typical one you'll see will be float. To cast to a string, you just simply put the word string in parentheses. And just so you know, all of these are unquoted. These aren't treated as strings. These are like keywords in PHP. So PHP knows to interpret that as that this is a cast. And then to cast to a Boolean, you simply do Boolean or bool. To cast to null, you put the word unset in between parentheses, which is kind of like the unset function we had talked about in the lesson on the null data type. And the reason it wouldn't normally be like null is because can't use this because null is a keyword, is another keyword in PHP. As we know, it's the literal value for the null data type, which is why you use unset to cast a variable to a Boolean. To cast a variable to null. Something we're not going to really deal with that much, but mentioned for sort of sake of completeness, is you can also cast things to an array using the word array and to an object. And the set type function allows all of these same casts. It just uses them in a different format. So if we want to cast to string, for example, we would type the function set type and then we would put the word string in quotation marks, because this function actually accepts, it needs a second argument to be a string. And in this case, it's a string set to the value string. But we also could, maybe we want to cast string and we want to cast it to an integer. So we could put int in here as well. So let's take a look at some PHP code that uses these in action. So here are some explicit casts using the parentheses syntax. So here we have a float variable called float1 that we're assigning it the literal 1.25. Then we're going to create an integer variable, which is its value is the float1 variable's value cast to an integer. So it's going to take 1.25, cast it to an integer, and set it equal to int1. And as mentioned, parentheses syntax, it doesn't touch the data type of float1. Float1 is still a data type still a float data type with value 1.25. However, int1 is going to be of the int data type. Then we go ahead and do another cast. We cast int1, which is an integer, to a string using the parentheses syntax with the word string in between it. and then we convert the string to a Boolean using the Boolean cast when we simply put bool in parentheses. So if we look at this, the output of this script, we can see the parentheses syntax. We have we declared a variable float equals 1.25, and we do run the var dump function on that variable float1, and the var dump again outputs the type and value of a variable. It says it's a float variable, it's equal to 1.25. Now when we've created, in the other line of code where we created an integer variable, which was the value of the float variable cast to an integer, we can see that int1, it is an integer data type, and its value is 1. So as you can see, one thing you might notice is that it stripped off the 0.25. Because integers are whole numbers and they can't have fractional parts, when you cast a floating point number to an integer, it actually strips off the numeric part, the fractional part. And so that's something important to notice. Also notice, though, that because this was a parentheses cast, it doesn't change the type of the variable to the right of it, and so float1 is still a float variable with a value 1.25. Now we're going to go ahead and we have int1, which is equal to the value of 1, and we're going to cast it to a string. And we can see down here that that makes this string1 variable of the string data type, and in this case, var dump for strings, it outputs the length of the string, which is 1 character. And here what it's done is just taken the number 1 and converted it to a textual, to a text string, which is just the text representation of the number 1. And there's a difference between the number 1 just flat out and then the number 1 in quotation marks. The number 1 in quotation marks is a string, and it's treated as such. And the number 1 as an integer or a float value is something you can do arithmetic operations on. In the string version, you can do string operations like concatenate and stuff. So that's where data types do become important, and that you might look at the 1 as being the same thing. There's a 1 here and a 1 up here, but they're not quite the same. Then finally, we did a Boolean cast of the string, and we can see that Boolean1 has become a bool data type, and its value is true. And if you'll notice, the string1 is still a string, and it still has the same value. And so basically what happened is when you cast a string, and we're going to learn about this in a couple of upcoming slides, when you cast a string value to a Boolean, it has certain rules to decide whether it becomes true or false, and actually the number 1 ends up being true. And so there are actually like a lot of different rules when it comes to typecasting, and it's somewhat complicated, and there's a lot of different things to go over. And so actually at the end of the lesson, I'm going to have a link to a page on the PHP website where you can read more about it, because there are many different scenarios of how casting from one type to another of what actually happens. As mentioned, parentheses syntax does not change the type of the value operated on. It only changes its value only changes the data type of the value for the assignment operation. So if we go back and look at the code again, there's a section created for explicit cast using the set type function, and basically done kind of the same thing we've done up here with the same variables and the same values. We have a float equal to 1.25 that we've cast to an int. Then we have an int equal to 1 that we cast to a string which is the text string 1, or the character string, which is just the number, the text character 1. We're converting that to a bool. And what we're going to see when we look at it is that unlike the parentheses syntax, it actually changes the type of the variable that's passed to the function. So here we have float equals 1.25. When we pass it to the set type function and we pass it this string parameter that says int, which means cast it to an int, float1 now is actually an integer, and it's actually an integer, a value of 1. So the actual the actual data type of float1 actually changed. Likewise for all of the other different conversions. When we convert int1 to a string, int1 becomes a string data type with the string, which is the number 1. And then down here, if we have a string that is, I don't know why this is unclear, but it's basically the number 1 in between double quotation marks. When we cast that variable to a Boolean type, it becomes string1 becomes a Boolean data type is true. And so, as mentioned, set type permanently changes the type of the variable that you pass to it when it does a cast. So now I want to talk about a couple of sort of common conversions. There are many different rules, as I mentioned, that happen when converting from one data type to another. And we can't go over all of them, but I'm going to talk about a couple of the more common ones. One of the most common conversions is converting things to strings. And actually, we've already been doing this in our code. We haven't explicitly talked about it, but anytime you use double-quoted syntax and variable interpolation where you have a variable within double-quoted strings, PHP is actually converting the value of this variable to a string data type. So for example, if we had a equals 1, and then we echoed the variable a in between parentheses, what PHP is going to do is it's going to get the value of the variable a, which is the number, the integer 1. It's going to cast it to the string data type because Echo only knows how to print out strings, and then after that cast, then it outputs it. So some of the common conversions that happen to strings is if you have an integer or a float, when you convert them to a string, which you've seen in some of the code that we've done, like in our store web application, for example, like the calculation of the price, it takes the number and it just converts it to its text version. So 14 becomes the string 14. And if we have a float value like 2.5, that just becomes a string 2.5. So that's a pretty intuitive conversion. Some of the less intuitive ones are if we convert the Boolean value that's true to a string, it becomes the value 1. If we can convert a Boolean that's a Boolean value false, it becomes the empty string, which is just a string with no characters in it. And if you convert null to a string, it also becomes the empty string. So for example, if we had let's say we had a Boolean variable, bool1 equals true, and then we wanted to output that, we did echo bool1. What it's actually going to output is it's going to take bool1, it's going to see that it's the value true, it's going to convert it to a string, which as we can see over here is 1, so actually the output of this is going to be just the string 1. Now one thing to note here is that in this echo statement I've enclosed the variable in double quotation marks, and typically you actually wouldn't do that. You would just write echo and then the variable name. You'd use the double-quoted syntax when you actually had other things that you were including in this string here, like you might say bool is equal to and then output the variable as value. But when you use it in this way as well without the double-quoted syntax, because echo works on string data types, works on string values, it's going to implicitly cast this bool data type to a string, which in this case becomes 1, and this is also going to echo out. It's going to echo out the string 1. So there are also some numeric conversions that happen. We talked about one earlier, and that's basically when you convert a float. One of the most important ones, when you convert a float to an integer, it basically rounds down to 0, and it strips off the fractional part. So if you have a number 1.76, and then you were to cast it, let's say to an int, then its value would now just be 1. So that's something important to note. Now, also the addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division operators, they all require float operands to operate. So when you have an addition operation or a multiplication operation, any of these, it takes both the operands and it converts them to floats and then performs the operation. Now because, for example, it's going from int to float, the only other number that we'd have would be, type of number is an integer. When we convert that to float, it simply becomes the same number. So 1 as an integer would just become 1.0 as a float, so that doesn't really cause any problems, whereas if going from float to integer, you end up losing information. So anyways, these operations all convert both their variables, both of their operands to float values, perform the operation, and then return a float value. The only exception to this is when you have two integers that are evenly divisible, then it actually returns an integer. The other thing to note as far as automatic arithmetic conversions go is the using the modulus operator. And basically the modulus operator converts both of its operators to integers before it performs its operation. So if you had something like 7.5 mod 3.0, PHP would it would convert them both to integers, so this would actually end up being, and we know when you convert a float to an integer, it strips off the fractional part, so it becomes 7 mod 3, which is equal to 1. So I just kind of want to finish up with talking about some Boolean conversions. And basically when you different rules that apply when you convert certain values to a Boolean. Basically, as far as Booleans go, any value that you cast to a Boolean, to the Boolean data type, is going to be true except for these cases right here. If you cast the integer 0 to a Boolean, it's going to end up being the Boolean value false. Likewise, for the float value 0, the empty string, which is just a string with no characters, or a string containing just a number 0, and also null. So if we were to cast Boolean null, the value of A would be false. So in general, the rule with Boolean conversions is basically anything except for these, well, it is the rule, anything except for these values, it's going to be interpreted as true. So for the homework challenge today, I'd like you to go and look at this link on the PHP manual website and explore some of the links on this page. It's called type juggling. It also has a section in it called typecasting, which is sort of the heart of the material. And just kind of explore around, because there are a lot of different rules that apply when casting from one data type to another. There are a lot of different intricacies when you go from floats to ints, and then especially, we've talked about some of the more common ones, converting floats to ints, converting numbers to strings, but then you can also do things like convert strings to numbers, convert numbers to Booleans, and so forth, and there's all sorts of different rules that apply. And so in order to know exactly what PHP is going to be doing when you use these operations, you have to refer to the website to find out all the different things that happens. And the rules aren't too many, but they're somewhat complicated, and so it'd be a good idea to go and review them before you start using them. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching Educator.com. Look forward to seeing you at the next lesson.